So I've started the recording. This is being recorded. And if you know of somebody who wasn't able to come, this will be posted on Ashland Chautauqua's YouTube channel. So you can go and look. We already have the Lizzie Borden talk up there, but it won't be too long till we'll be able to get Charles' talk up. So welcome, welcome, welcome. I'm Delisa Randall Griffiths, and I am one of 7 committee members who plan Ashland Chautauqua throughout the year. And as I was saying earlier, one of the little gems that we held on to after the crisis of the pandemic was that we could gather virtually on Zoom and have these book discussions about these interesting characters. So this is one example of a good thing that came out of a really bad situation. We host a 5-day live event every July in our town. And so if you haven't heard of us before, ashlandchautauqua.org. We have a website and you can see our history. We're on our 23rd year of doing programming. And so we will have a whole lineup this summer, and you would be welcome to come visit us. We can't do any of the things that we do without funding. And we are really grateful to Ohio Arts Council and Ohio Humanities because they support us. Ashland Main Street is an organization built on the businesses in our small and picturesque little community. And they have taken on the role as our fiscal agent so that we can get grants from those agencies to keep the funding. So we're grateful to them. We're grateful to Explore Ashland, which is our Convention and Visitors Bureau. They are very supportive in what we do. So many people helped us create what we've created and continue with programming like tonight. So we're talking about one particular book tonight. So this is the Malcolm Talks to Young People, and it's speeches from the US, Britain, and Africa that have been edited by Steve Clark. And Charles Pace is gonna start us off with just an overview about Malcolm X. And if you haven't read the book, that's fine, because he is just a wealth of knowledge. But even if you haven't read the book, feel free as you're listening to him to put questions in the chat. And then after his little overview, we will give him some questions to answer and see what all he has to share with us. So Charles, I'm going to turn things over to you.
Thank you, Delisa, and welcome to my book discussion. This is a part of the prelude of the Ashland Chautauqua Summer Chautauqua with the theme, the famous and the infamous. There are several characters that they will be presenting. Lizzie Borden.
We can hear Pace though.
Lizzie Borden, Mary Surratt, Marie Curie, Annie Oakley, and this man, Malcolm X. Now, the theme, of course, as I said, is the infamous and the famous. But for me, whenever I do a Chautauqua, there's always a sub-theme. There's an inside story and the outside story. The inside story for me is about Chautauqua, and it has to do with the power of Chautauqua to bring people together to have a text-based, informed conversation. Chautauqua is a number of things. For me, it's also a scholar in residence program. It's a genre of cultural performance. And it is also what our colleague Jeff Smith said, it's a vehicle for jump-starting a community conversation. And the inside story that I'm talking about a community conversation, is that conversation that, you know, in this country started between 1776 and 1787, when the founders said that they would bring the colonies together to form a more perfect union. So that's always the question. How can whatever we doing, every character, anything, help us with that American experience? That's the first question. Now, as our chief Chautauquan in the Great Plains Chautauqua, as well as the chief Chautauqua for the National Chautauqua Tour, and our colleague in the Chautauqua Studies Institute, George Frine, reminded the scholars in the Institute the other night, is that a humanities program always began with a question. And so this one will explore two questions. One, why Malcolm X? What's the significance of this man who was born Malcolm Little, whom the world knew as Malcolm X, and who died El-Hajj Malik El-Shabazz? What can Malcolm teach us about forming a more perfect union, not only in the United States of America, but a more perfect union among citizens of the planet Earth? That's the first question. The second question is, why this book? I chose this book specifically. I mean, there are any number of books that I could choose to talk about Malcolm X, but I chose this one, Malcolm X Talks to Young People. Speeches that he gave in the United States, in England, as well as in Africa. Well, the first thing is a way of dating Malcolm's growth. If you will remember the talk that he gave dated February 11th, 1965 at the London School of Economics. He's talking there to those students at the London School. Also, 10 days later, at the Ottoman Ballroom, February 21st, 1965, Malcolm is shot dead, 10 days later. So this book, with that speech, would give us the best representative of where Malcolm's mind was within 10 days of his death. That's the first thing. The second would be this idea of talking, I'm getting my ears on, of talking to young people. When Malcolm X was talking in 1965, I was a young person. And I tell you, I felt that Malcolm was talking to me. And I felt that as much, if not more, than I thought that, because Malcolm was someone who evoked feeling in people. He certainly evoked feeling with me. And so for when you have a man who will talk to young people, that means he's engaged in, I guess if I would use a theory, Afrofuturism, because young people is the future. He was talking to the future when he talked to those young people. Second thing, in 1965, the center of the movement had shifted. It had shifted from the South to the North. As we know, the modern civil rights movement really was a Southern movement, beginning the state right next to me, the state of Arkansas, in 1948. My homeboy here in Texarkana, Arkansas, Silas Hunt, integrated the law school in Fayetteville at the University of Arkansas. This act not only integrated the school in Arkansas, it was the first time that a Black had been admitted to a primary white university since Reconstruction, 1948. 1950, Heman Sweats integrates the University of Texas at Austin. 1954, we have Brown versus the Board of Education. 1955, 169 miles northeast of here, we had the integration of Central High School with Days. 1954-55, we had the Montgomery bus boycott. 1956, University of Texas integrates and brings in its first group of undergraduate students. So the late 1940s and 1950s, it's a Southern movement. By the time we reached 1964 and 1965, the Civil Rights Act has been signed, the Voting Rights Act is about to be signed, and the movement shifts. And when the movement shifts north, the one person that galvanized the attention of the nation was this man, Malcolm X, talking to young people. And so it's a personal story for this young person. In 1964, I was a senior in high school. If there wasn't band practice, I would beat it home, sit in front of the television set, 3 channels, ABC, CBS, NBC. I'd turn on the news to see if I could get Malcolm X. When Mama would come home about an hour or so later, at that time she was teaching at Dunbar, she'd see me, she'd go, "Hey, baby." I go, "Hey, Mama." She said, "What you doing?" I said, "Well, I'm here looking at the news." And she said, "Well, anything happening in the world?" I said, "Well, I'm trying to see if I can get a glimpse of Malcolm X." She said, "Malcolm X?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Oh, Lord." Now, Mama was very modern, but I have to say she was more of a modern person than she was of a Malcolm person. But Malcolm galvanized my life. So in many ways, this discussion about Malcolm X talking to young people, and I was a young people, allows me to track my own life. And not only track my life in terms of my understanding of Malcolm, but it tracks my life in my exploration, talking through the voice of Malcolm. Case in point, that third lecture in the book talks about Malcolm X, talks to young people in Temple number 7 or Mosque number 7 in New York City. This was a group of high school students that comes from McCall, Mississippi, and Mrs. Watson contacts Malcolm and asks him, would he talk to those young students? Malcolm tells us in that essay, of course. He said, there would be nothing I would feel more honored to do than to talk to these young people. As he speaks to these young people, he said, I've never been to the state of Mississippi, but I've always wanted to talk to somebody from Mississippi. And he tells them what they have to do as young people. They have to learn to think for themselves, to read for themselves, to analyze for themselves. And if they can do that, they can come to their own conclusion and not take conclusions of people whose opinion had been foisted upon them. He also tells them of all the disciplines, he said, history is the one that can reward all research. Now, of course, when I became aware of Malcolm saying that, I had to perk up because of all the required courses I had to take either at Dunbar High School or Texarkana Junior College. The course I liked least was history. Malcolm started talking about how the movement was shifting in the international arena. And of course, we were concerned in this country not only about the civil rights movement, but what was happening in Southeast Asia. Malcolm talked in that talk with young people about something that happened in the Battle of what he called the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. So of course, I ran up to the library, got me some books, read about Dien Bien Phu. Dien Bien Phu, when Chairman Ho Chi Minh and his famous or infamous general Vo Nguyen Giap defeated the French in what was called French Indochina at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. And little did I know, if when we fast forward 4 years, what do you think I'm going to be? I'm going to be in Southeast Asia. I'm going to be in Vietnam. I'm going to be engaged in a police action against Ho Chi Minh and Vo Nguyen Giap. And I'm going to read in the Stars and Stripes a quote from an Army major that echoed exactly Malcolm's analysis of the situation. That major said, what was the difference that he saw between the American fighting force and the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong? He said, the Viet Cong fought with more heart. I'm standing there at the desk at the medic station where I'm working, and I'm remembering that's exactly what Malcolm said. Malcolm said the United States will not succeed in Vietnam. He said if the French, who had been there for 100 years, couldn't succeed, how did America think it could succeed? And I remember back when Lyndon B. Johnson said that he was not going to send American boys to fight what Vietnamese boys were doing, but yet and still here we were. And those Vietnamese was fighting with more heart. Malcolm talked about a revolution. He said, you don't know what a revolution is. He said, you use that term revolution. He said, a revolution is dirty. A revolution is bloody. He said, you don't be singing, we shall overcome in no revolution. He said, you don't do no singing because you too busy swinging. Malcolm analyzed it to a T. So I had to say Malcolm was correct to understand that you had to know history. Other talk he gives in this book, Malcolm is in Ghana. He's at the University of Ghana in Legon and Accra in West Africa. Fast forward to 1980, I'm in Ghana. I'm at the University of Ghana in Accra in Legon. I'm sitting there talking with a lady who's about to interview me on the show. And she says to me, she says, when Malcolm was here 15 years ago, I interviewed Malcolm. She said, indeed, Malcolm sat in the same seat that you are sitting in. Malcolm and me once again. Malcolm talks in this book about being at the London School of Economics and also at Oxford University. And he's talking to young people, and he's telling us how he was received by young people. In 1977, I had resigned my position at the Texas Union. 3 days later, I'm in London. I do my Frederick Douglass show at the London, not the London School of Economics, but the London Musical Club. I hear there's an organization down at Piccadilly Circus called the Shootout Club. And they said that every Monday, international audience from not only from the UK, but all over Western Europe will come there and engage in what we would call an open mic. Well, quite naturally, I'm going to go down there and see if I can engage in an open mic. So I go down and introduce myself to the person who was the host, explain to them that I did one-man shows, and I wondered if I could perform. And so he tells me, sure. He said, you put your name down and come back in about a week, and we'll tell you when you can come on. So I said to him, I said, oh, wow, I'm sorry, sir. I said, I've been in country for 3 days and I'm only here 4 more days. And he stopped and he said, you do one-man shows? I said, yes. He said, well, who do you do? I said, I do Frederick Douglass, I do Malcolm X. And when I said Malcolm X, he brightened up. He said, you do Malcolm X? I said, yes. He said, hold on. And he left. He was gone 15 or 20 minutes. So I sat down and I ordered me an ale and I chunked down a cold one and I was waiting. Well, no, that's not true. I didn't chunk down a cold one because, you know, the Brits are strange. They don't drink their beer cold. They drink it warm. But that's all right. I chunked down a warm one. And so soon he came back to me and he said that after he had told all the people who had signed up that there was this American here and he did Malcolm X, he asked if someone would volunteer their time. They all said, we'll volunteer our time. Let the American perform because we want to know about Malcolm X. So again, Malcolm and me, I'm seeing how the young folks, a decade and a half, are interested in Malcolm X. Another case in point, Malcolm's at the London School of Economics, and he's talking about image. And he's talking about the image of the African man or the Black man in the white mind. And he talks about how Black in the white mind is always projected as a savage. And one of the examples that he used was Jomo Kenyatta, who at that time was the president of Kenya. Kenyatta is a Kikuyu, and he was the leader of the Mau Mau movement. And it was years later when I'm studying anthropology and I'm reading the history of anthropology, and I'm reading about the two founders of social anthropology in the West, A.R. Radcliffe Brown and Bronislaw Malinowski. And I'm going, wait a minute. Jomo Kenyatta wrote his dissertation under Bronislaw Malinowski. And Malinowski said that Jomo Kenyatta was his favorite student. I mean, he was his premier student. So how can a man who can be the premier student of the founder of anthropology in this civilized environment 20 years later be a savage leading a movement? That's because that's how they had portrayed Malinowski. So again, 1980, I'm in East Africa. I'm in Nairobi. I'm at the University of Nairobi. Jomo Kenyatta is still the old man, they call him that time. Jomo Kenyatta is still the president. So I do my presentation of Malcolm. There's a little tension between me and the students, but after it's all over, we sort of worked that out. So I'm back in country another year, and I'm not performing in Nairobi, but I have a day and a half layover. And so I'm waiting, so I go by the American Culture Center and hook up again with the Cultural Affairs Officer, the American Cultural Attaché, who had taken me there the year early. And he tells me, he said, you know, he said, it's an interesting thing. He said, after your performance of Malcolm X, he said, my relationship with the students of the University at Nairobi has never been better and never been warmer than it has been after your performance. And of course, I realized it's not me. It wasn't me that did that. It was Malcolm X's ideas that opened up that relationship. Final example I give. 1980, I have resigned my position as a program advisor at the Texas Union. And I'm reminded of Malcolm was at the Oxford Union. And this idea of unions that started in Oxford in about 20 years had taken over the world in terms of colleges and universities. We know that the college union is the community center. It's the place that brings people together. And so though I'm no longer working for the Association of College Unions International or the Texas Union, they were having their regional meeting at DFW Airport at the hotel, and I give the keynote address. And I'm there and I'm about to go back to Africa, and I'm talking about the union and the idea of democracy. And on my way over to Africa, I stop off for a day and a half in Athens. And this is the place that 2,000 years before had been the center of democracy in the West. And I'm here only because Malcolm X allowed me to make this trip. So when I think about Malcolm X and I think about my own life, I think about how he had empowered the Afro-American players coming out of a multicultural education class, an Afro-American studies class at the University of Texas at Austin. I'm thinking about how when we linked up with the University of Texas and the Texas Commission on the Arts and Humanities that had force multiplied our voice. I'm thinking about our friend Scott Bobb that interviewed Glodine Baker and Freddie Gardner, the Afro-American players, over the Voice of America. So now our voice is super empowered. And the first time he interviewed us, he said, it's going through West Africa. The second time he interviewed us, he smiled and he said, that's all world. Well, that all comes from what Malcolm said, History is what empowers you, it force multiplies you, and it super empowers you. This is all linking up with what I got from Malcolm X. So that's why I chose this book to talk about. Malcolm X talks to young people, because from a personal perspective, Malcolm X was talking to young people, but he was also talking to me personally. That's the first question. The second question then is, well, why Malcolm X? And who was Malcolm X? And I got 2.5 minutes to tell you, and I'll give you my take on who Malcolm X and why I think Malcolm can help us form a more perfect union, not only among those of us in the United States, but help us form a more perfect union in engaging in dialogue and action in terms of a world community. I call this Malcolm X Pilgrim in Search of a Common Humanity. When the man known as Malcolm X was assassinated on 21 February 1965, a physically young yet spiritually complete life was brought to an all too early abrupt end. In his brief 39 eventful years, Malcolm had achieved a degree of wholeness in his life that few humans of any age are fortunate enough to experience. Malcolm was a man who had transcended 3 major rites of passage: a rite which led from his ego, through his ethnic, and into a global sense of his human potential. He had achieved a pan-human state of political and spiritual growth. Malcolm X said in his last days that he had come to champion that which is good for humanity as a whole. As a young street hustler, Malcolm had been concerned primarily about the satisfaction of his personal carnal pleasures, his ego needs and desires. After his prison sentencing for petty criminal activity, he was forced to reflect upon the quality of his life. He joined the Nation of Islam, the so-called Black Muslims, under the leadership of Elijah Muhammad. Upon his release from prison, as a reward for his superb organizing and speaking ability, Mr. Muhammad appointed Malcolm to the post of national minister. From this involvement, Malcolm developed a deeper sense of his ethnic responsibility to teach and awaken the so-called brainwashed minds of the Black masses. Malcolm helped Black America to see their plight in historical and international perspective. Finally, in the wake of his ouster from the Nation of Islam, acceptance of Orthodox Islam, he was a Sunni, and conversion experience in Mecca, Malcolm was forced into an encounter with his wider global self. He toured several African and Middle Eastern countries, often as the personal guest of presidents and prime ministers. This series of mind-expanding encounters convinced Malcolm that American white racism was not genetically determined, as he had formerly believed, but rather socially constructed. The significance of this discovery was that he came to see that radical socio-political, i.e. structural change within American society could cure it of its 300-year-old white racist tradition. His writing and speeches provide a record of the growth and the development of a constantly evolving mind. The autobiography of Malcolm X is now an American cultural classic. It documents a life of struggle, change, and triumph. Thus, it is not a tragedy, but rather a living testament of hope. Now, after more than a half century following his death, his words can serve as a catalyst for new thought. His life is a rich legacy for the rest of us to explore through history, film, anthropology, literature, visual arts, poetry, music, dance, theater, courses and seminars in a variety of settings, American studies at its best. This is what it is for me, at any rate. Over the past 47 years, I have spoken his life and analyzed his words with audiences from Texas to Tanzania, South Dakota to South Africa, and from Old England to New England. There is an African saying which says, to speak a dead man's name and words is to make him live again. I speak, thus X lives. Enough said. Now, I'll put my ears in and I'll be able to answer some questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Charles. So I don't see any questions in the chat yet, but please feel free. I have a couple of them that I can start with, but please feel free to add your questions in the chat and then I will share them with Charles. So don't be shy. Hopefully everyone can work that chat feature. I'm going to go ahead and start with one of the questions that was sent to us by Dorothy Stratton. And since you prefaced or focused on this book of speaking to young people, here's how she says it. So Malcolm confuses me with his repetition that Blacks should demand their rights by any means necessary. Even when a young person asked him directly if he included violence, he just gave the answer by any means necessary. Did he think and mean that violence would be necessary for Blacks to make progress toward their rights in the 1960s?
No, not at all. Blacks would make their progress as a reaction to what whites did. Malcolm was not a violent man. He never advocated violence. As a matter of fact, one of the criticisms that even the more moderate so-called Negroes said against the Nation of Islam, they said that those Muslims should talk a good game, but they don't do anything unless a Muslim is hurt. And here we are out on the line. Elijah Muhammad, first of all, said that they should be non-engagement. He wanted the Nation of Islam to withdraw within its own organ. Preferably, he would have liked to have gotten some land someplace so that they can be on their own. He wanted non-engagement. But of course, you live in America, you're going to have to engage. And since you're going to have to engage, Malcolm said that the one thing that you want to be is a total human being. And so what should you do to become a total human being? He says, well, you remove the obstacles. And how do you remove the obstacles? By any means necessary. He said, if a man want to sit down and talk to you in a civil, human way, that's what you should do. If a man want to engage in you in debate and dialogue, that's what you should be. You should use whatever is necessary to influence and to exert your humanity. However, if the government, if the state, if the police do not protect Black people when white people will come into Black neighborhoods and kill Blacks, women, and children, then Black men should do the same thing that white men do. You should protect your family by any means necessary. If you can go, hey, don't come in here, and they turn away, that's a mean necessary, and they go away. If you go, hey, don't go away, and they'll go away. That's all necessary. However, if they start to invade your property and your premises as a human being, you have a right to protect yourself by any means necessary. That phrase meant literally and figuratively exactly what it meant. You are a human being. You should exert that by any means necessary.
Thanks. John Anderson just asked, you mentioned Malcolm being ousted from the Nation of Islam. How did that come about?
Oh, good question. That really happened over a series of really years. And it happened with people telling Malcolm, Malcolm, there are some things happening in the nation that you're not aware of. And you don't seem to want to be aware of them. And Malcolm himself realized this. He said, here was this man who was teaching that he was the representative of Allah on earth, and I supported him. He said, eventually, several secretaries came to Malcolm and revealed that they had been impregnated by Elijah Muhammad. And then even then, Malcolm started to call up some of the brothers and said that we need to figure out, what we can do this. Even Noah committed adultery. And so even it's written. And then they began to say, if you knew what Brother Malcolm was saying about the messenger, you would kill him too. And gradually Malcolm started to understand that there were forces around the minister who was getting older. And eventually there would be a power shift because Elijah Muhammad didn't have too long to live just in terms of his health. And who was going to take over? Well, the most popular person would have been Malcolm. But the one incident that made the difference, it was after the assassination of President Kennedy. Elijah Muhammad had told Malcolm and the ministers to make no comment. And Malcolm said, he said, I'm used to just coming out with a comment. And when they asked me what I thought about, Malcolm said, it was a case of the chickens coming home to roost. And he said, what I meant by that, he said, this country that was founded in violence, the violence against the Black man, the violence against the red man, now that same violence had exerted itself and knocked down the leader of this country. And he said, the minister called him in and told him, he said, Malcolm, he said, that was a very bad thing that you did to have said that. And Malcolm said, I know, sir. He said, I submit 100%. Malcolm said he left Arizona, came back. He said, I was driving that Ford down Riverside Drive, and word came that Malcolm had been ousted. And it said, but he will be reinstated if he submits. He said, I thought, if he submits, he said, well, of course I submit. And gradually Malcolm started to understand, there were forces inside the organization, that it was a point where the contradictions within the group, where Malcolm had to tell the truth. Malcolm was about speaking truth to power, regardless of where that power was. And he said that many of those guys and ladies are in the nation because I brought them in. And I now realize that some of the things that I had been said, that I had been taught, were not true. And I've got to admit that. And that started the clash. And ultimately, he realized, I can't be a part of this organization. So he formed two organizations, the organizations of AfroAmerican Unity, which would be a political organization, and the Muslim Mosque Incorporated, which would be an Islamic organization. So politics and religion. And that power shift ultimately led to the split, and ultimately he was assassinated.
Okay, so here's a question that ties into religion from a different angle.
Mm-hmm.
So Ruth asks, do you think Malcolm's negative stance against Christianity alienated people, especially Black people, and thus they did not fully hear what he was trying to say.
I would not say that Malcolm took a negative stance started about Christianity. The Muslims don't take a stand toward against Christianity, because you got these three religions that are religion of the book. You got Judaism, you got Christianity, and you got Islam. Jesus is considered a major prophet in Islam. Jesus is not considered to be the Messiah, but Jesus is a very revered and respected figure. So it's not against the teachings of Christ. And so we make a distinction between the teaching of Christ and what those who call themselves do in the name of Christianity. So therefore, when the Ku Klux Klan come and burn a cross in their use, they use that symbol of Christianity and they say they are Christians, and that's what Malcolm was against. Malcolm's father was a Baptist minister. So Malcolm was not against Christianity at all in terms of those who are followers of Christ. What Malcolm was against were people who use the mask of that to then oppress other people and tell them you are nothing, and because you are not a Christian, you're going to die and you're going to go to hell. That's where Malcolm differed from the so-called Christian. So it depends upon how you define the term Christianity, but Islam is not a religion that speaks against Christianity.
Are there more questions? I'm not seeing them come through the chat. Please don't be shy. Please ask. I'm finding myself wanting to ask questions that are more about Charles than about Malcolm, so I'm trying to rein myself in. I am going to throw something in though, because you were talking about, oh wait, no, here's some come. Hang on. Let me back up here. Okay, so were there young people that believed in both Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr.?
Okay, say it again.
Were there young people that believed in both Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr.?
Okay, I guess I was having a problem with believed in. Well, I was certainly one of those young people. I had the greatest amount of respect for both of them. And as we would know, if one would get the book by Professor Pernell Joseph, professor of history and the LBJ School of Public Affairs of Lyndon B. Johnson, which is the best analysis that I have seen of the two, called The Sword and the Shield, is a comparative analysis between Malcolm and Martin. They started to understand what the real enemy was. In 1960, I guess 66 or so, when Dr. King at the Riverside Church came out against the war in Vietnam. And he came out in the poverty program, and he began to realize that it was poverty and it was policy that was holding Black folk back. Malcolm, that was where Malcolm had been for years. So there was not really a clash between Dr. King and Malcolm personally. What the clash was really about where the emphasis was. Dr. King and the civil rights movement put their focus on civil rights. When you talk about civil rights, you, as Malcolm tells us, you're talking about civil society. You're talking about the laws of the United States. You're talking about the laws of the country. And he said, when you talk about the laws of the country, our African brothers and our Asian brothers and our South American brothers cannot speak in our interest, because they could be characterized as interfering with the domestic sphere of America. He said, but if you raise it to the level of human rights, he said, now that's a different question. He said, that's the right that United Nations in its Universal Charter of Human Rights said. He said, those are your God-given rights. He said, civil rights is given to you by the nation states. Human rights are given to you by God. And so he wanted to elevate the struggle to a level of human rights, which now makes it an international struggle rather than just a domestic struggle. So if I would say there was one major philosophical difference between those two. It was the civil rights of Dr. King and the so-called civil rights movement, and it was the human rights movement of Malcolm X. However, when you study the so-called civil rights movement, that wasn't the name that Dr. King gave it. That was a name that the journalists gave it. The original name of the movement was the Movement to Save the Soul of America. It wasn't just about civil laws. They said there's a moral defect in the country, and we got to raise that moral defect to have the country obey the teachings of, in terms of the Christian religion, in terms of loving your brother as you love yourself. That was a contradiction between those two things. Malcolm chose to focus on the contradiction one way. Dr. King chose it to function on another way. But in terms of human rights, that would be the major philosophical, political difference between Dr. King and Malcolm.
Okay, we do have questions coming in. So here's the next one. Doris said, I believe I read in the book that the Nation of Islam was not accepted as a true part of the Islamic religion. Was the Islamic organization that Malcolm X started accepted by Islam?
Yes, it was. Malcolm had to go through a same procedure that any Muslim has to go through. The man, and I'm drawing a blank on his name, who was head of Islam in the West, became Malcolm's personal teacher. And then Malcolm spent time in Egypt at the university there studying Islam. And ultimately, what makes it clear that you are accepted is when you are given permission to go on the Hajj. And when Malcolm was given permission to go on the Hajj, when he came back, he was El Hajj El Shabazz. So at that point, he was a Sunni. You have two major Islamic sects. You have Sunni and you have Shia. Malcolm was a Sunni. So yes, he was accepted in the world order of Islam as a result of his training in that religion.
This next question comes from Carolyn Gordon, and she asks, please speak to the difference between religious traditions of men and faith-based living. In short, were some members of Islam and some members of Christian denominations, in short, were some member of Islam and some member of Christian denominations can be lost in traditions and not essence of Islam and Christianity? I'm not sure I am capturing that quite right. Carolyn, you are welcome to unmute if you want to help. Yeah.
Thank you. Good evening, everybody.
Okay, yes.
I think you answered the question when I was trying to type it in. That's why it's so confusing. I was trying to listen and type at the same time. But do you get the essence of what I mean? That some members of both can be lost in the traditions, the way we always did it, and not practice the essence of each, as in love and Christianity. That's what I was trying to say.
Exactly. Because we remember that religion is a cultural system, and it's going to follow the dictates of what not only the general religious teaching, but the specifics of the culture that one is in. And even within that, there are going to be differences. I mean, you have your difference between Baptists and Methodists and Catholics and Episcopalian. So they all of these splits, they go that way, but they have certain essence and certain principles that they all adhere to. So that's the true believers. And then, of course, since religion is a very powerful institution in all human society, you get the relationship between the spiritual principles and the power that comes with having that. That was the problem that Malcolm was able to realize in the Nation of Islam, that there were definite, even though they were not considered orthodox, there were definite good and wonderful ideas with their practice. But then when the power came in, now you got the problem, right? So yes, and that's always the question. It goes back in some ways to a quote I think that Abraham Lincoln said. He talked about if you want to know a person's character, it says that you put them under stress and struggle and their character will come out. But Lincoln said, no, you want to know a person's character, give them power. And then you give them power and then it's going to come out. Well, the same thing is true of an individual. The same thing is true of a culture. The same thing is true of a society. When you get power, then sometimes that power takes over you. And ultimately, in a capitalistic or socialistic society, since we got to have trade and we got to have finance, therefore money. And then the Christian tradition said, what's the root of all evil? It's not money, but the love of money. It's what that power and what that money does to you in terms of your soul, in terms of how you see yourself in relationship to other people. And the more power and money you get, if you start to elevate yourself over those who have no money, then boom, now you got to split even within a tradition. And that's true of any tradition, of any religion, because ultimately they are human constructs. And it's how the people in those societies construct their religious tradition to help them to unify themselves around their principle. And then the struggle is can you stay within it? I remember I was at the University of Michigan in Dearborn and I did Malcolm X. And we went out that night and there was two young Arab Americans. One was a young recent graduate at the University of Tennessee. Another was a young MD. And they they were critiquing my show. And they said, he said, we would ask you a question as Charles, I asked you a question as Malcolm, and then one of us would split it, and then you would give the answer. And I said, oh yeah, I think I see where you're coming from. And I said, I said, listen to what you're saying. I said, as a Black American, we always saw Malcolm as a Black man who happened to be Muslim. He said, yeah, he said, I know. He said, but you see, we see Malcolm as a Muslim who happens to be Black. And then the other young man talked about jihad. He talked about the greater jihad and the smaller jihad. The great jihad is with the world and with the infidels. And then the smaller jihad is the struggle that you have within yourself to fight those two tendencies. And that's how they see it within their struggle. So yes, tradition means a lot. And it's difficult to break tradition. As a STEM trained person, I'm reminded of the philosopher and historian of science, Thomas Kuhn, and the most significant book that I had in graduate school was a book called The Structure of Scientific Revolution. And it doesn't matter if it's a Christian, if it's a religious revolution or a scientific revolution. Thomas Kuhn said that when a new paradigm comes in, a new shift, he said the smart scientist doesn't attempt to convert the old scientists. He said that's probably not going to happen. They are invested in the system. He said the smart professor does something far more strategic. He trains their graduate students because they are not invested in the old system and what you were referring to as tradition.
Thank you, Carolyn. I'm so glad you reworded that because it made so much more sense when you said it. And look at this amazing answer that came out.
Yes, and thank you very much. Thank you.
So here's a question from Celine Phillips. She asked, please talk about Malcolm X and Muhammad Ali's relationship.
Oh, that was a wonderful relationship and in some ways sort of tragic. Muhammad Ali, of course, won the heavyweight champion. He became a member of the Nation of Islam, principally through the teaching and the advice of Malcolm X. He came into the organization, and when Malcolm had the split with the nation, Ali chose to stay. And because no Muslim was allowed to talk to a hypocrite. At that point, Malcolm became a hypocrite. So Ali would no longer speak with Malcolm. And he talked about the time when Ali was in Africa and Malcolm was in Africa and they passed each other and Malcolm said something to him, and Ali turned his back and wouldn't even speak to him. Ali, at the end, many years later, said that was the one great mistake that he regret, how he ostracized Malcolm after Malcolm had been a big brother to him. But they once had a very close relationship. But when Malcolm and the Nation of Islam split, Muhammad Ali stayed with the nation, and therefore, they went that way.
I'm not seeing questions right now, so I'm going to shift to something that you and I talked about yesterday. Dorothy Stratton asked a question about the play, The Meeting, which I didn't know about. So I looked it up. So it's a play, it's a conversation between, fictionalized conversation between Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. So she says, what can be learned by watching and listening to The Meeting by Jeff Stetson, the dramatized conversation between Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. So I'll let you.
Well, actually, I've never seen the play, but I can tell you what can be learned. For me, when I talked about in that little dissertation that I read about what Malcolm, the influence he has in influencing all of us in literature and poetry and drama and film, is that his life becomes a catalyst for new thought. And for me, that's just one other example of how Malcolm has influenced this playwright. On Amazon Prime, there is a play, there's a movie that was nominated for several awards that looks at the conversation between Malcolm, Jim Brown, and Sam Cooke. So that's a modern film with Malcolm. Spike Lee, I did, of course, the autobiography of Malcolm X. So the Black Panther Party that grew out of Oakland, California, upon the assassination of Malcolm X. Bobby Seale and Huey P. Newton said that the Black Panther Party was the organization, continuation of the ideas and philosophy of Malcolm X. So Malcolm X continues to influence thinkers in a number of genres who takes the ideas from Malcolm, as I did as a young man, and extend them through whatever creative endeavor they want to do it, with visual, performing arts, politics, intellect, or whatever. So for me, that you can learn how Malcolm affected that particular man named Jeff Stetson to write that play.
Well, and I'm not sure who, I don't recognize the name that comes across on Zoom, but somebody amongst us said I did the, I'm guessing, New Jersey premiere of The Meeting in 1988, and I
That was me.
Yeah, that sounds like
that was me. That's Marvin Jefferson. I
sound like Marvin Jefferson. Okay.
Yeah. And I met Jeff Stetson and all of that. Yeah, I did it at the George Street Playhouse in New Brunswick, New Jersey. Yep, that was
Thanks,
me.
Marvin. I didn't recognize whose computer that was.
Yeah, that was me.
Yeah. Well, and I think as we were talking, Charles, yesterday, didn't you say there was also a play or a movie that it was a conversation between Malcolm X and Muhammad Ali? Was that right?
No,
No.
A movie that's a conversation between Muhammad Ali, Jim Brown, and Sam Cooke, which was after Muhammad Ali won the heavyweight champion in Miami, set in a hotel room in Miami.
I got that one confused. Are there other questions? So, okay, you've got to tell them the story that you told me though. So we were talking about the, these plays that have been done that are these recreations. Will you tell the story you told me about when you gave advice on a one woman show? Yeah.
Dear friend, two actually, Elizabeth Van Dyke, who is a solo actor. She does a wonderful one woman show called Love to Own Lorraine, about the life of Lorraine Hansberry. At one time she was going with, she is now married to one of the great producers, a man named Woody King Jr. I happened to be one day at the Henry Street settlement in New York City that Woody King Jr. runs. And Liz had me come over to advise a young lady who was doing a one-woman show that eventually opened off-Broadway that won an Obie Award. And she said, Charlie, you know, since you do one-man shows, would you talk to her? So I went and I was talking to this young lady, and I could hear a conversation of people practicing in the next room. And so Liz said, oh, Charlie, you should go and check that out. She said, there's a play that's being in rehearsed. It's called The Meeting. And I said, well, what's that about? And she said, about Malcolm and King. And I said, oh, who's playing who? And she told me who was playing Martin. And I said, well, who's playing Malcolm? She said, oh, yeah. She said, this wonderful young actor named Denzel Washington. Right. And it just so happened that the young lady that I was giving advice to in this one-woman show was a young lady by the name of Felicia Ayers Allen. Of course, we now know Felicia Ayers Allen as Felicia Rashad.
Wonderful story. And now I can add to it. So Denzel Washington, Marvin Jefferson. Yeah, okay. Yeah. We'll just put them there together. Okay, I do see Ruth Silent did let us know that the movie that he was talking about with Muhammad Ali, Sam Cooke, and Jim Brown is called One Night in Miami, right? Okay, so make sure we got that right. We are going to send a follow-up email tomorrow, and I'm going to include the books that Charles talked about. He talked about the Sword and the Shield and the autobiography of Malcolm X. So we'll include those in that email. So if you want to do more reading, you've got some excellent sources to do that. Are there any last questions? Oh, yeah.
I was just going to say, and also get the book by the Paynes. I'm trying to blank on the brother's name, and
it's Les and Tamara Payne,
yes,
right?
Les and Tamara Payne. Les was an excellent journalist. He died all too soon, but his daughter finished the book. And last year it won both the Pulitzer Prize and the Biggie, the National Book Award. And it's really interesting when you think about what they won. Several years ago, the brother who created the Malcolm X Study Center in Columbia University, Marvin, who am I talking about?
Manning Marable?
Manning Marable. Manning wrote an autobiography of Malcolm. It also won a Pulitzer Prize. And unfortunately, the week before the Pulitzer Prize was awarded, Manning passed away. So he never knew that that book won the Pulitzer Prize. So that's two books, both biographies of Malcolm X. They both won the Pulitzer Prize. So there's this tremendous interest in Malcolm X. And that's my point about Malcolm X in terms of addressing us. The autobiography of Malcolm X came out in 1965. It has never been out of print. I know of no book except the Bible that's been in print, you know, this amount of time. So there is this tremendous interest in the autobiography of Malcolm X. And I was just tripping online about 4 or 5 months ago, and I saw in Istanbul that a major thruway has been named the Malcolm X Thruway. So Malcolm is still very much alive in the world community.
Dorothy Stratton mentioned that there's also a biography called Malcolm X, A Life of Reinvention. I don't know if that's
I didn't
one.
know that. Okay, I'll have to look
That's
at
Manning Marable's book.
Oh, okay.
Oh, that's Manning's book.
Okay. We do have another question. Please talk about Ozzie Davis and Malcolm, especially Ozzie's obituary.
Oh yeah, that's great. Oh boy, I owe so much to Ozzie. Pearly Victorious and the music Pearly. I mean, that was the second play that the AfroAmerican players did. We did the Pearly Victorious, and we did the music Pearly. I spent my last year in New York City. My buddy your opinion. Said, Charlie P, he said, you ever seen a Broadway show? I said, no, Joe, I never seen a Broadway show. He said, come on, I'm gonna take you to see Pearlie. So I went to see Pearlie with Joe, and about midway through, it was starring Cleavon Little and Melba Moore. And I was watching Cleavon Little, and I said to myself, I said, is this acting? I said, is that acting? And I'm talking to myself. I said, I can do that. I said, I know I can do that. And then I later said, but is it good acting, right? And then when the Tony Award nominations were released, Melba Moore and Cleavon Little were nominated for Tonys, and they won Tonys. So I said, not only is that good acting, that was the best acting in a musical by their peers. So I owe Isaac a lot for creating that play. But the point is that Isaac was very close to Isaac Davis, and Ruby Dee were very close to Betty Shabazz and Malcolm X. And Isaac delivered the eulogy at his funeral. And he talked about Malcolm as being our great shining prince. And he even took emphasis to talk about, have you ever known Malcolm to say an unkind thing? And that smile that he made. And he talked about Malcolm was our manhood. Malcolm was our great shining manhood. Malcolm was an example even for Black men in terms of manhood, race, class, gender studies, both in a national and international community. I was in Zambia. How I was received in Africa was amazing. I did my show in Zambia. There was a party after the program, and we were around a professor's apartment. And so I noticed a lady, young student sitting over there. And as the party got smaller and smaller and smaller, I looked around and she was sitting right next to me. And she looked at me and she said, brother, she said, we came to see your show and we came with an attitude. I said, well, why? She said, we wanted to know who is this Black American that the American government is sending over here pretending to be Malcolm? I said, how did I do? She smiled and she said, you passed. People have a possessive attitude toward Malcolm. I was in my hotel room that Sunday morning. There was a knock on the door. The door didn't have any locks on it. This guy I said, come in. This guy walked in my room. I'm in my bed and he sat there and he did 30 minutes worth of Malcolm to me. I'm in Liberia. Liberia at this time had just had a coup. Master Sergeant Samuel K. Doe had overthrew the government, the Americo-Liberians, and from the first time, the indigenous Liberians were ruling the country. They were under a 6 to 6 curfew, and a brother gave a party, and I was at his party, and he asked me, he said, have you read the Quran? Do you know about Malcolm's religious life? I said, well, no, I said, I never really, I'm more into his political life. He said, oh no, he said, you have to understand Malcolm's religious life. And he gave me a copy of the Quran, and I started to read it. And I'm reading it and I go, wow. He said, it's beautiful, isn't it? I said, yes. And he said, and you should hear it in Arabic. He said, this is why we call it the perfect book. He said, that's not a chauvinistic statement. He said, it's written in a certain way that we have to memorize the book. And it's written in something that's very similar to verse. So if you say a word and that's wrong. It's like if you were playing a tune and you had a discordant note. Even if you didn't know the tune, if there's a note that doesn't work, it just wouldn't work with you. He said that's how the Quran is written, and that's why we are able to read it and memorize it as we do. And then about 10 minutes later, he went and he changed clothes and he came back, and then he was reading it to me in Arabic. He said that he had studied in college in Cairo. And he said he had met Malcolm when Malcolm was there. I said, really? He said, yeah. He said, I looked up, that was Malcolm walking down the street, and that was all of these people who were following him. And he said, one of the things that I noticed, he said the sun was going down and the sun was shining in his hair, and it's how red his hair was. I said, I never really saw him. He said he had this fiery red hair and this red skin. So wherever I go, I find people. San Diego, California Council brought me to San Diego to do Malcolm X at the opening of a branch library. It was called the Malcolm X Library. I look up and a group of Black, obviously followers of Malcolm, came in, they sat down and they observed my program, and they sort of ceremoniously, after I did my questions and walked out, they told me, you pass. People are very, very particular about Malcolm. They're very possessive about Malcolm. And if you go public in front of Black folk and you call yourself representing Malcolm, you better come out right, or they are going to be on your case. That I've discovered in several countries, in several states, in several cities in this. So that's when I went back, when I told you, when I was a little boy looking for Malcolm, I said, I felt Malcolm talking to me. That's what I meant. I felt Malcolm long before I was able to assimilate Malcolm's ideas. Malcolm is not just a legacy, he is a living legacy in the world.
Thank you, Charles. I could sit and talk with you about this for days, it feels like. And I do think this maybe is a time that I want to share slightly sad news for Ashland Chautauqua. And that is that we were 2 years ahead booking these events, and circumstances have made it so that Charles isn't actually going to be able to join us in July and portray Malcolm X, but we wanted him to be here and do this book talk. Now, he has left us in good stead, though, because he recommended Derek Johnson, who also does Malcolm X. And Charles will say, call him a live ringer for Malcolm X. So he will be portraying Malcolm X for our July event. It's the only person that we're switching, and we decided to just hold off till the end of the book talk to let people know that. But sad as it is for us, we won't be hearing Charles Pace as Malcolm X in July, but I'm sure Derek will do a wonderful job too. Yeah. So I don't see any other questions. I do want to, well, Star just put there's a survey that she put in the chat box. You can use that link to fill it out. It should also pop up, we hope, as you leave tonight. Please, if you could fill it out one way or the other. It'll also, I think, be a part of the follow-up email. So one way or the other, if you could please fill out the survey. The granting agencies love survey data. And so the more we can give them, the better we are for funding future projects. So we appreciate that. So it's been great spending time with Charles. Please join us again. Diane Moran, it will be February 17th. And she's covering the book, The Assassin's Accomplice, Mary Surratt and the Plot to Kill Abraham Lincoln by Kate Clifford Larson. And then March 24th, Susan Marie Franchek will cover Madame Curie, a biography by Eve Curie, her daughter, which is an interesting perspective. And then we'll finish things up April 28th with Elsa Wolf, and she has chosen The Colonel and Little Miss, Buffalo Bill and Annie Oakley, and the Beginnings of Superstardom in America by Larry McMurtry. So those are the 3 books we still have to come. We hope you join us. And then if you can make it to Ashland, Ohio in July, we will be seeing all of these characters July 12th through the 16th. And we would love to have all of you who could make it come and see the performances. Thank you again for coming. Thank you again, Charles, for leading us in a great discussion and sharing your life and how it intertwines with Malcolm X's life. We so appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right. We will let you all go on with your evenings, and we are so glad that you joined us.
Good to see you. Thank you, Delisa.
Thank you. Thanks for coming, Marvin. And thanks
Oh,
for
yeah.
sharing. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Thank you, Charles.
Thank you, Charles.
Mhm. Yeah. Feel free to unmute and say your goodbyes to Charles if you want.
Thanks, Charles.
Take care, Charles.
Thank you for coming.